Donald Trump wants to impose a 10% global tariff on America's trading partners after the Supreme Court ruled most of his previous levies have been illegal. Trump said the 6-3 ruling left him, quote, deeply disappointed and accused the Supreme Court of being, quote, swayed by foreign interests. The U.S. president vowed to deploy new methods to impose tariffs, including a sweeping new duty on all foreign trading partners. Here's President Trump giving his reaction at a news conference.
Foreign countries that have been ripping us off for years are ecstatic. They're so happy. And they're dancing in the streets, but they won't be dancing for long, that I can assure you. But other alternatives will now be used to replace the ones that the court incorrectly rejected. We have alternatives.
And joining me in the studio now is Steven Beardsley from DW Business. Thanks for joining us.
Hey,
so the Supreme Court has decided that his tariffs were illegal, and now he's responded with this 10% global tariff. How long will that last?
I think that's exactly the question that everyone's wondering. You know, the Trump administration has a number of levers that it can pull, and it's made no bones about this in the past few months. And it said that if this ruling takes place, as it did take place, we have other mechanisms. The question really is, what is their legality? How would they actually fare before the courts? And what often ends up happening with a lot of Trump legislation, or a lot of his executive maneuvers, I should say, is that they do end up going before courts, and then they're challenged at some point later. Sometimes they're even pushed back. This was a remarkable ruling, and how he's responded so far with this 10% base tariffs, that's under a different section of law that actually requires, it allows tariffs up to 15% base, but then Congress has to act after 150 days. That's problematic because Trump, for one, has said that he doesn't want Congress to have any part of his tariff regimes. And also, Congress probably doesn't want to decide on this as well. They have midterm elections coming up, and this is a vulnerable point for them. We know that affordability, the issue of cost in the U.S., is a major point for voters right now. They don't want to have to go and defend raising taxes on consumer goods, and that's ultimately what they would have to end up doing. But again, this 10%, this mechanism that he's using right now, this law is actually probably as vulnerable than the one that's just been struck down. So in many ways, it seems like it would be a matter of time before that would be challenged as well.
And so there's a lot of uncertainty right now, and I'm curious how international markets are responding so far. Have there been specific countries that said anything?
I think everyone's reacting with caution right now because they do know that there are these levers. We haven't seen any sort of bold statements, nor did we expect any, because they know that this is an administration that will pull out every mechanism in the book until it is tested in the courts. That's the only reason there was pushback on this one, was because ultimately it was tested by an American company, we should point out. These were not foreigners who were paying these import levies. They were American importers in most cases, and American consumers who were paying for it at the end of the day when they were passed on. That's important to point out because this is an administration that keeps saying that foreigners are ultimately footing the bill for this. They are not. It is Americans. It's a tax on Americans. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you know, markets are going to try and figure out what the vulnerable sections of certain businesses are that are going to be hit by this. Because with this 10% broader tariff, that sort of changes the landscape a little bit. There's some countries that are going to be advantaged because of that. There's some that are going to be disadvantaged. And so some companies may be exposed to new trade routes because of this, and the markets are going to try and suss that out. But you're not going to see any countries probably come out and start, you know, thundering about wanting their money back or something.
Okay, so this sounds messy, but I understand it gets even messier because there's the question of reimbursements for those companies who've already paid the tariffs. Unwinding that feels like it would be a headache.
Right now we know there are about 1,800 companies that have litigation before U.S. trade courts about tariffs that they feel like were unduly levied. Now they're going to be clamoring for that money in many cases. The question is, who has the record of how much was paid and who is ultimately due that money? So U.S. Customs collects it. Did they have records of it? Do the companies themselves have records of every single import shipment that they brought in and the tariffs that were levied on that? Another problem is that studies have shown that anywhere between 60 and 90% of the tariffs imposed, those were passed on to customers, but only under the law.
Customers, how are they going to get that money
How are they
back,
going
right?
to get that? That's a responsibility of the business itself, because under the law, only the importers are obligated to receive the reimbursement. Will they pass that on to customers? Some, DHL, for example, has already come out and said, we have the technology to show exactly what customer has paid what. We're going to reimburse them. Will other customers be able to say that? On top of that, there's one more issue, is that some importers have sold the right to collect their reimbursements to third parties, which then may go before the courts and say, we actually have the obligation to receive this. It's very confusing, and this is going to be a muddle because the Supreme Court said, essentially, you're owed this money, but it didn't lay out how that process was supposed to happen.
Now, Stephen, very quickly, Trump premised the whole rollout of tariffs saying that this would benefit America and American consumers. Where do things stand on that?
There's no evidence that it's benefited anyone except for the government revenues themselves. The government's made a lot of money on tariffs. It's interesting because it's not the government, it's not Congress that decided that, but it's the president who's basically created his own carve-out for collecting a ton of money, up to $200 billion, that now the majority of that is due back to businesses. But we've seen prices go up. We've seen inflation go up. We've seen that there's economic activity that hasn't happened because of these. This is a tax on businesses, on American businesses and people, and that always has economic friction and economic consequences. It hasn't benefited Americans.
Steven Beardsley, thank you very much. And now let's cross to our Brussels correspondent, Rosie Birchard. Rosie, Trump had said earlier that the Supreme Court decision meant that everyone in the rest of the world is dancing in the streets. They're so thrilled. Anyone dancing in Brussels?
Well, there was certainly a sharp intake of breath in Brussels when this news broke out of the United States Supreme Court on Friday, but I certainly haven't heard any champagne corks popping here or seen any dancing in the street, and that's because it comes with a whole load of uncertainty. The official European Commission position so far is that they are just analysing this ruling and that they're trying to remain in touch with the US administration to work out what the consequences of it might be. When you talk to EU parliamentarians, they're a bit more outspoken. They say that they see this as kind of, in principle, as a good sign for the rule of law in the United States. Remember, this past almost a year since the US first announced those so-called reciprocal tariffs has been a pretty painful lesson for Europe and for the world in just how much power that presidential pen can hold in the United States. And this court decision is seen as a first real check and balance on that. But that's the principle. In practice, does this bring any more certainty for European businesses? Not really. And in fact, amid that uncertainty, because we know Donald Trump is coming up already with a plan B, the first response you'll see from the European Union side in Brussels is that a plan to improve the next steps of ratification of a trade deal which the European Union signed with the United States last July to avoid the pain of even higher tariffs. That vote was due to be held on Tuesday, and we're very likely to now see that delayed because officials and parliamentarians here just don't know exactly what the consequences of this Supreme Court ruling are going to be for that deal, which I should say was seen as a very bad deal for the European Union, lopsided at best in the United States' favour.
And despite the Supreme Court ruling, tariffs, for example, on steel and aluminum remain in place. So what does that mean for the European Union?
Well, precisely. And it's those sectoral tariffs that are really especially biting here in Europe. Things like the steel industry. We've seen a real dip over the past few months in steel exports from the European Union to the United States. And if you look at the biggest economies in the world, so the United States, China, the European Union as a bloc, if you look at their trade to GDP ratios, the European Union is higher than either the United States or China. That means more of the wealth of the European Union is linked to buying and selling internationally. And that means it's more exposed to things like export restrictions or sudden decisions out of the United States. So there's been a kind of a real rethink of how the EU should approach trade in general here as a response to this. And certainly those key industries, the likes of the steel industry, really calling out for more support from the European Union, given that they have seen, they've really felt the pain from these sectoral tariffs, which, as you said, are not in doubt in any way after this ruling.
The threat of tariffs has so far been a central instrument of Trump's foreign policy, for example, in the dispute over Greenland. Will dealing with him now become easier for the European Union because using tariffs as a weapon appears to be off the table, or Trump is being put on a tighter leash by the Supreme Court?
A tighter leash, perhaps. You might think this would even the playing field, but the EU's trade relations with the US have been really complicated by the fact that it relies on the US for things outside of trade. So actually, Brussels has quite a lot of muscle when it comes to trade policy. If it wants to, it could hit back hard with tariffs that could have a major implication for the United States. But because the EU is seen as reliant on the US for the likes of its defence, and it's been so concerned about what would happen to the future security of Ukraine, for example, well, it's been pretty hesitant in terms of actually bringing that muscle to the table. And in fact, what we've seen the European Union do is really try to look at how can they find other customers to buy their wares, because the fact is that the damage has been done when it comes to the United States' reputation as a reliable trading partner. And over the last few months, what we've seen is Brussels go on something of a deal signing spree. They have dusted off trade deals that had been languishing in archives that were stalled for years, if not decades. And just a few weeks ago, I was in Paraguay. The EU signed a major trade deal with South America's Mercosur bloc. Since then, we've seen the European Union conclude negotiations on a free trade deal with India. Similarly, last year we saw a big trade deal signed off on, initially at least, with Indonesia. The strategy, therefore, of trying to replace those customers from the United States is well underway in the European Union. No Supreme Court decision is going to change that. Of course, those trade deals won't kick in overnight, and there has been some pushback to them. This is not an uncontroversial policy here in Europe. We've seen some protests, for example, from farmers. The policy, that principle won't change, but I think the fact is that businesses are still going to be suffering amid all this global uncertainty.
Got it. DW Brussels correspondent Rosie Birchard there.